Hello to all. Last time we explored the conservative movement of the late 19th century, which was dominant in the United States. Today we are continuing our exploration of the political movements of the late 19th century by focusing on the populists. They were either a party of their own, the Populist Party, or they were often associated with the Democratic Party. You probably have never heard of them because they are not anymore a party in the US Congress, but they were very prominent in the 1880s and 1890s, especially in some parts of the South and the Great Plains. Kansas would be kind of ground zero for the Populist Party. And the level of activism and enthusiasm about them was great. People really thought of them as the next big thing. So why is it that all these people in Kansas were that excited, or unhappy, I should say? Why the unrest? Well, the first thing had to do with the tariff. And if you're not familiar with a tariff, it's simply a tax that is levied on foreign goods imported into the US. That if a good, like a car, comes from Japan, when it goes into the US, it has to pay a tax, and that tax is called the tariff. So the tariff is set by the US Congress, which can be set either high or low. Low tariff, the good thing, is good for consumers because that means that you have a lot of competition between domestic goods and foreign goods, and that forces domestic manufacturers of, say, cars to keep good products and to keep prices low. Otherwise, they will be swept with products from, say, Germany or Japan. On the other hand, it is bad for local manufacturers because they face stiff competition. And we see that nowadays the tariffs tend to be set pretty low through organizations such as NAFTA or the World Trade Organization, and the result has been a lot of competition against American manufacturers and the loss of industrial jobs in the past 20 or 30 years. On the other hand, if you're a customer looking for a pair of jeans made in Bangladesh or a cheap plastic toy made in China at the local Walmart, this is heaven for you. A high tariff, on the other hand, would be good for local manufacturers because they are in a kind of cocoon protected from foreign competition, and that allows them to pay inferior goods to local customers at high prices. A high tariff would also be bad for people in the US who export a lot, such as, say, farmers in the late 19th century, because if the US is unwilling to buy foreign products, then other countries will retaliate and refuse to buy American products. And so there will be a glut of agricultural products on the US market, and the prices will be low. As it happened, the tariff during the Gilded Age was set very high, the reason being that the conservatives were in power and they were very close to business interests, the manufacturers of the Northeast, and they wanted to protect them against foreign competition, which is great for manufacturers or their employees. Not so good if you're a farmer in the Midwest and you have to buy that harvester. In that case, you're stuck buying American, even if harvesters from Britain might be better quality or cheaper. The high tariff wall makes it difficult to import them. Farmers, which tended to export a lot of farm goods like grain and beef, well, they couldn't do it to Britain because by retaliating, Britain would have a high tariff wall on goods from the US and instead would buy beef from Argentina, for example. So that contributed to a glut on the US market where you already have too many products in the late 19th century, specifically grain products. And if you have too many products, you know the law of supply and demand, and the prices go low. So that's a problem for farmers. Whatever goods that they buy to produce, like harvesters, are expensive. Whatever goods they want to export, like grain, are cheap. There's a glut of them, and all that is connected to the high tariff. So they feel angry about that. Another issue that is common in the late 19th century would be monopolies. And a monopoly is whenever you have a single company that is controlling an industry. Some of these monopolies might be kind of natural. Building a railroad, for example, is quite expensive. So going through a small town in Kansas, you only have one railroad. You can't have like 4 different railroad companies competing for your business. So instead, you often have just a single company operating. And if it's a private company, well, they want to make as much money as they can. And there's no pressure for them to keep prices low since they have no competition. Again, it's a monopoly. So in practice, you have things that farmers would rely upon in the Midwest, such as railroads or grain elevators or things like that, which are in the hands of a single company, and they would charge an arm and a leg for farmers, and that would make it very difficult to export your grain or your cattle to, say, Chicago, so that it would be slaughtered there. And the farmers are upset about that. Who controls those big railroad companies? Well, oftentimes they would be controlled by big moneyed interests in Wall Street and the like. So again, there is a sectional divide where the farmers in the Midwest or the South are losing out to big moneyed interests in the Northeast. The last thing that they were upset about was the gold standard. And nowadays, people in the US don't spend too much time thinking about monetary policy, except maybe for a few nerds who are all about Bitcoin and such. But the gold standard was a big issue in the late 19th century, especially among farmers. People paid attention to that. So what does that mean? It has to do with how the US government produces and prints dollars. Most of the dollars that you have in your pocket will be made of paper. It's a $20 bill. The paper itself is worth nothing, but somehow you accept it as currency for $20 just because it says $20 on that piece of paper. How come? Well, back in the 19th century, the norm was the gold standard, meaning that the US government was expected to keep as much gold in its coffers as the amount of paper currency that was issued. So if it had, I don't know, $100 billion worth of gold in Fort Knox, then in that case, the US government could issue, as part of paper money, $100 billion in paper. And that meant that there was a lot of trust in the money. So it's good. It means the US dollar is strong, and that's called the gold standard. It's good for the stability of the currency, but it can be bad for the borrowers. Let me explain that for a second. If you have little money in circulation, and gold is rare, so if you have a gold standard and you have little paper money in circulation, in that case, the money is rare, and banks will charge high interest rates for you to borrow that money because there's only so much money in circulation. On top of that, inflation will be low as well. Inflation is how much prices rise year after year. And if you borrow money, you want inflation to be high because you're borrowing money as of, I don't know, 2019 when I'm taping this video. And if you're reimbursing it in 2030 and you have had a lot of inflation between, you're reimbursing the money with worthless currency as of 2030 when you borrowed very good currency back in 2019. So if you borrow at an interest rate of, I don't know, 5% and inflation is 6%, in practice, you have a negative interest rate. So for that reason, farmers wanted to have high inflation and low interest rates, and they got the exact opposite as part of the gold standard. The gold standard translates into money that is hard to get by, so high interest rates, and very low inflation, a very stable currency backed by gold, so low inflation. Farmers are usually big borrowers. They need to buy grain and machinery and land and all that and borrow heavily, and then plant their crops. And if they're successful 6 months later at the end of the season, then they get the money back and they can reimburse those debts. So they're always heavily in debt. And so they would lose out as a result. Who wins with the gold standard? Well, the bankers, because they can charge high interest rates. And because inflation is low, they are guaranteed to be paid back in money that has still a whole lot of value 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So it's a way, if you have a very stable currency, to punish those who borrow, in that case the farmers, and then reward those who lend out the money, in that case the bankers. Where are those bankers located? Well, no big surprise there again. They're in Wall Street, they're in Boston, they're in the Northeast. And so that led to a lot of rancor by the populists that whatever policy choice the Congress has made, whether it's for how high tariffs to set, or the way the monopoly is organized, or the way the monetary policy is set, every single time the people who are benefiting is from the Northeast. This is a banker, an industrialist from New York, and so forth. So that's why the farmers are all upset. The person who gave voice to their grievances was a man called William Jennings Bryan, the author of the Cross of Gold speech. And this is a document that you can easily find online. It's a classic document in US political history. William Jennings Bryan was from the Midwest, very devout Christian, but also a Democrat. And in 1896, he attended the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, as I recall. The convention back then was an actual place where you had delegates from all the parties in every state that would gather and actually pick who the next candidate was going to be for president that year. Nowadays, you still have a convention, but every state is kind of set ahead of time because you have primaries and you have pledged delegates. We'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the progressive era. But back then, you had actually delegates showing up in, say, Chicago, and anybody after a couple of days might emerge as the official candidate for that year. So Bryan attended as a delegate from Nebraska, and he was supposed to deliver a speech, and he did it about his favorite topic, the gold standard, and that's what became the Cross of Gold speech. Having behind us a commercial interests and laboring interests, he explained, and all the toiling masses, we shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And this is where the cross of gold name for the speech came back. That's from that particular line. Notice the use of biblical imagery. This is a person who's very Christian and speaking to people who are very Christian. Notice also the big divide between the laboring masses who are there to defend Brian and the elites that are trying to steal money from them. That's a very populist kind of a vision of the world. And notice a bit the slight anti-Semitic undertone, because if you know your Christian history very well, the people that encouraged the Roman governor to crucify Jesus were Jewish people in Jerusalem. And this has remained as a source of anti-Semitism ever since. And so this was kind of a subtle hint that William Jennings Bryan was having back then, that the bankers that you have in New York or Boston, who are those rich bankers? They are Jewish, and they are dominating or stealing money from all these farmers in the Midwest. The populist movement tended to be xenophobic. Xenophobic means that you don't like foreigners. In that case, Britain. A lot of the banks will be located in London. So the populists did not like the British either, the Jews and the British. So moving on to what you do about the problem once you have identified what the issue is. Well, it's pretty easy. You take every issue that I have outlined and you pick the opposite solution, right? If you think the tariff is too damn high, you want to lower the tariff, and that's what the populists were about. If they could convince the US Congress to lower that from goods, in that case it means that you can buy machinery from elsewhere, like say a harvester from Britain, and the prices will go down, the quality will go up, and you will have a cheaper machinery from your farm. In exchange, foreign countries will be more willing to buy American goods, specifically American grain and cattle, and the price for your products as a farmer will go up, and you will end that glut on the American markets. What about the monopolies, the second issue that I outlined? This is a bit more difficult to fix because there are places where you can only have a monopoly. It's called a natural monopoly. Earlier I mentioned building a railroad through a small town in Kansas. You can't have, economically speaking, 5 railroads going through a small town in Kansas to have competition. You have a natural monopoly. So the solution by the populists was to simply nationalize the railroads, to operate them in the public good. That if the government took over the railroads, and that's what nationalization means, then they would operate them, but for the public good. They would set prices that would be lower, they would not be searching profit at all expense, and that would be good for everybody involved. Any kind of a socialist kind of solution, far away from the more capitalist practices that were in vogue in the US in the late 19th century, and that is advocated by the populists on that particular issue. They are quite far left of center. What about the gold standard? Well, abandon the gold standard. What they wanted was to use other currencies to back the US dollar, specifically silver, which was a much more abundant metal. So you have free silver, they call that the free coinage of silver, was sometimes referred to as bimetallism, bi as in two, and metallism as in like metal, that you would have 2 metals to buy the US dollar, in that case silver and gold. And because silver is more abundant than gold, all of a sudden you could print a lot more paper money, far more in fact that the market could absorb. In that case you would have too much money chasing too few borrowers, so the interest rates would collapse. And because the government was running the printing press too hotly, you would have an inflationary tendency where the US dollar would lose its value. It's terrible if you're a banker because you will be reimbursed in worthless paper money. However, if you are a borrower, as a lot of farmers were, then it makes it very easy to borrow money and then to reimburse it at a low rate. So that's the essence of bimetallism. And if you read that speech by William Jennings Bryan, The Cross of Gold, that's the whole point, the free coinage of silver. Based on that speech, Bryan was nominated the official Democratic nominee of the Democratic Party, just based on the strength of that speech alone. So the populists that initially had a party of their own, the Populist Party, by 1896 kind of merged with the Democratic Party. And that 1896 election became a very important one where you have kind of a fight between the two movements that I've identified so far. The conservatives were epitomized by the Republican Party that year, and that would be William McKinley as a party of big business. And on the other side, the populists/Democrats of William Jennings Bryan was running for president that year. And the coalists were convinced that because they represented the laboring masses, for sure they were going to be elected. You only had a handful of Jewish bankers in New York on the other side. And as it turned out, they lost. They were quite disappointed by it. What they did not realize was that their policies would be not just against big business and against the bankers, but they would also be against a lot of employees as well, especially blue-collar workers. Because if you are working in Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Detroit or Chicago for a big company like, say, again, Pullman Railroads or the McCormick Harvesters, well, you want to be protected because that means there is no foreign competition and your wages will probably be higher and you have less risk of unemployment if your boss, the American manufacturer, is protected from foreign competition. In addition to which, the program of the populists was inflationary. They wanted for the price of grain to rise, for the value of the US dollar to plummet, which is good for them, not so much for the employee. If you are receiving a fixed pay every month and the inflation is high, that means that whatever pay you get is now worth less year after year after year. Your purchasing power goes down. And workers back then are living at the subsistence level, meaning most of their pay goes into buying food for their family. And if the price of grain goes up, well, that's the price of food. And again, the workers would lose out. So that's the reason why you have that unusual alliance between blue-collar workers and their bosses, who otherwise would have been at the loggerheads for a number of other things. So Bryan, much to his surprise, even though he thought that he was representing the masses against the elite few, lost that 1896 election, and that's true of the populists in general. They were very successful at the state level in places like, say, Kansas or Nebraska, but when it came to the national level, they never quite succeeded. They have some senators from some states, they have some governors from some states, representatives, but they failed to have a majority in Congress, or in the case of Bryan, to win the presidency. So compared with the conservatives that we studied last time, or the progressives that we will study next time, the populists are kind of a failure, a bit of a footnote in US history. They are also a good example of that shift in American industry away from agriculture, which used to be the dominant sector in the 19th century, and toward manufacturing. Something that would be reflected at the polls. Now the big cities are where the people live, and if you look at that map of 1896, the election, you'll see that those cities are the ones that carry the national vote. But it's also true in the national psyche altogether that now the people that are idealized by the masses will be the big captains of industry and not the farmers that used to be the dominant sector back in the days of Thomas Jefferson. And they suffered from that as well. It's not just an economic loss that they have through the gold standards and such. It's also a sense that they are the forgotten minority. So why do we care about them? Well, for a while, they were a big flash in the pan. For about 10 years, they dominated American politics, but also because their style has continued all the way to the present time. We don't have a populist party anymore, but we do have a populist style of politics that has remained ever since. Things like the notion that you have a war between the classes, the laboring masses, and the elite few that are exploiting them. The us versus them mentality. Or the notion that the US worker is threatened by some exotic foreigner, whether he's Jewish or British or any other nationality, the anti-Semitic or racist or xenophobic tone. And generally the kind of tone that you see in the speech by William Jennings Bryan, that populist or even demagogue tone, demagoguery meaning that you want to please the crowds in a way that's a bit self-serving. So that, whether it's xenophobia, anti-Semitism, demagoguery, the us versus them mentality, the belief in conspiracy theories is something that has survived long after the Populist Party ended. Later on in the class, we'll study Huey Long, a governor and senator from Louisiana, very popular in the 1930s. Well, he was a Democrat too, and very much in the populist mold, defending the little man against the entrenched few, and he too had presidential aspirations. Then we will move on to the 1950s, and we will study Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican, in that case, a Republican senator from Wisconsin. So he came from a different party, he had definitely the very same view of the world, us versus them, the fear of conspiracy. In that case, he was obsessed with communist infiltration of the US government. From that same decade, in the 1950s, I have a book by Richard Hofstadter, a famous historian, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. An old book, but still a classic. I highly recommend that you read it if you're interested in the topic. Going back to the populists of the late 19th century, or even before that, it kind of falls outside of the scope of this class. But in the 1850s, you have a party called the Know Nothing Party that was violently anti-immigrant. So that's kind of an ancestor of the Populist Party. Moving forward to an era that Richard Hofstadter was not aware of, in the 1990s you have a politician named Ross Perot who twice ran for president with great success. He was not a Republican or a Democrat. He ran as a strong third-party candidate. His actual policy proposals were very protectionist and pro-strong dollars, so that would not have played well with the populists. But his style was very reminiscent of the populists of the late 19th century. Always railing against Mexicans, NAFTA, foreigners, also a very big fan of conspiracy theories. And moving forward to our current political environment, I will let you guess if you can think of a politician, either on the Democratic side or the Republican side, who would be known for his xenophobic kind of program against foreigners, maybe immigration, maybe foreign manufacturing, a lover of conspiracy theories, and a master of demagoguery when he's addressing the crowd. Do we have one of those? If so, that would be one of the long-term legacies of the populist era of the late 19th century. Well, next time we will move on to another topic. This will be another party from the left. They were called the Progressives. The big difference being that they were quite successful at the polls. A few presidents were progressives, and so a lot of the legal environment that we live in today would be directly based on the laws passed by the Progressives 100 years ago. See you next time.